Before we examine the battle records and the numbers, it seems worth pausing on a few details that rarely make it into the popular accounts, things that complicate the familiar story, or simply add texture to it. The T-34 was designed by an American, Mikhail Koshkin. The Soviet engineer who led the T-34's development drew significant inspiration from the work of American inventor J. Walter Christie, whose suspension system became the mechanical foundation of the T-34's running gear. The Soviet Union had purchased 2 Christie tanks in 1930, officially listed in export documents as agricultural tractors to bypass US export restrictions. From those 2 machines, Soviet engineers developed one of the most influential tank designs in history. The Tiger's 88mm gun was never intended for tanks. The gun at the heart of the Tiger, the KWK-36, was derived directly from the Flak 36, an anti-aircraft cannon designed to shoot down aircraft at altitude. German crews in the Spanish Civil War had discovered almost by accident that it was equally effective against armored vehicles. The decision to mount it in a tank came not from a planned program, but from the shock of encountering Soviet armor in 1941 that standard anti-tank guns could not reliably destroy. The T-34 was initially rejected by Soviet commanders when the T-34 entered trials in 1940. It faced considerable institutional resistance within the Red Army. Senior officers were accustomed to tanks, designed for infantry support, and found the T-34's characteristics, its speed, its diesel engine, its sloped armor, unfamiliar, and, in some cases, suspect. It took the personal intervention of General Semyon Timoshenko and a well-timed demonstration run from Kharkov to Moscow and back to secure approval for mass production. Mikhail Koshkin died before the war began. The man who created the T-34 never lived to see it prove itself in combat. Koshkin had driven one of the prototype tanks on the demonstration journey to Moscow in the harsh winter of 1940, and the cold and physical strain of the trip left him seriously ill. He died of pneumonia in September 1940, 9 months before Operation Barbarossa. The tank that would help save the Soviet Union had outlived its creator before the war that defined it had even started. Germany's own engineers called the T-30 for the best tank in the world. In 1941, following the first encounters with T-34s, in the summer of 1941, a commission of German engineers and military observers was dispatched to inspect captured examples. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The T-34 was, at that moment, the finest tank in the world. The commission recommended that Germany simply copy it directly. The proposal was rejected partly due to industrial constraints, and partly, one suspects, due to the difficulty of admitting that the enemy possessed something superior. The Tiger I had a separate driver just for steering. Operating a Tiger I required a crew of 5, and the division of labor was precise. The driver operated the steering and the gearbox, which was notoriously demanding, a semi-automatic transmission with 8 forward gears that required careful management to avoid mechanical damage. In the early production models, the effort required to steer at low speed was so great that some crews developed a workaround. The whole gunner, seated beside the driver, would assist with the steering levers when maneuvering in tight spaces. More Tigers were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. This is perhaps the most consequential fact in the entire Tiger story. Of all Tigers lost during the war, a significant proportion, estimates vary, but consistently exceed 50% in certain campaigns, were destroyed or abandoned by their own crews due to mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, or the impossibility of recovery and repair. The Tiger's complex suspension, its demanding gearbox, and its sheer weight made it extraordinarily difficult to maintain in the field. A tank that cannot move cannot fight, regardless of how formidable its gun may be. Soviet factory workers slept next to the production line following the German invasion in 1941. Soviet industrial facilities were dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, an undertaking of staggering scale, moving entire factories by rail while the front lines contracted around them. At the Ural tank plant in Nizhny Tagil and at the Selyabinsk complex that came to be known as Tankograd, Tank City workers, many of them women, teenagers, and worked shifts of 12 hours or more and frequently slept on the factory floor. In the winter months, some sections of the plant had no roof. T-34s rolled off the line in conditions that would have been considered impossible under normal industrial planning. The first Tiger I ever captured was taken undamaged in January 1943, near the town of Mga outside Leningrad. Soviet forces recovered a Tiger I that had become stuck in boggy ground and been abandoned by its crew. The vehicle was largely intact, It was shipped to the Kubinka testing ground outside Moscow, where Soviet engineers spent weeks analyzing every aspect of its construction, its armor composition, its gun, its suspension, its weaknesses. The knowledge gained from that single captured tank directly informed the development of both the T-3485 and the new generation of Soviet anti-tank guns that would be deployed at Kursk 6 months later. A T-34 once drove through a German headquarters in October 1941. During the chaotic early months of the German advance, a single T-34 commanded by Senior Sergeant Dmitry Lavrenenko drove into the town of Mtsensk, which German forces had just occupied. In the confusion of the encounter, German soldiers, unaccustomed to seeing a T-34 at such close range, initially assumed it was a captured vehicle. Lavrenenko's crew destroyed several vehicles and caused considerable disorder before withdrawing. Lavrenenko went on to be credited with 52 tank kills, making him the highest-scoring Soviet tank ace of the war. He was killed by a mortar fragment in December 1941, aged 27. With those details in mind, let us turn to the broader story, the one that both tanks share, and that neither could have told alone. To understand what these two tanks were, it is necessary to understand the circumstances that produced them, because neither the T-34 nor the Tiger I was the result of abstract engineering ambition. Both were responses to a specific, urgent, and often desperate military reality. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, its armored forces consisted largely of Panzer IEs, Panzer IE, and Panzer IVs, capable machines by the standards of the time, but designed against a set of assumptions that the Eastern Front would rapidly overturn. Among those assumptions was the belief that Soviet armor would be broadly comparable to what Germany had encountered in France and North Africa. The T-34 was something different. German after-action reports from the summer and autumn of 1941 described it with a consistency that bordered on alarm. Its sloped armor deflected shells that should have penetrated, its diesel engine did not catch fire as readily as petrol-powered equivalents, and its wide tracks allowed it to move through terrain that immobilized narrower German vehicles. The standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, at that stage of the war, was effectively useless against a T-34 at anything beyond very short range. The Tiger I was conceived, in part, as an answer to this problem, a vehicle that could reliably destroy Soviet armor at distances where Soviet guns could not effectively return fire. Development had begun before Barbarossa, but the encounters of 1941 accelerated the program considerably. The first Tigers reached the front in the late summer of 1942, near Leningrad. That their debut was not encouraging. Of the 4 Tigers committed to that first action, 3 broke down before reaching the enemy. The 4th was recovered by Soviet forces. It was shipped to a testing facility outside Moscow, where engineers with calipers and notebooks spent weeks recording everything they could learn. The legend of the Tiger, in other words, began with a breakdown. It is a detail worth keeping in mind as we examine what followed. A comparison of the two tanks on paper reveals a relationship that is more complex than either the Tiger's admirers or its critics tend to acknowledge. Both vehicles had genuine strengths, and both had genuine weaknesses, and the question of which mattered more depended entirely on the conditions in which they were being used. Walking through the key specifications on armor protection, the Tiger I's frontal armor, 100mm of rolled homogeneous plate, was, in absolute terms, the thicker of the two. Against most Soviet anti-tank weapons in 1942 and much of 1943, it was effectively impenetrable from the front at normal combat ranges. The T-34's armor was thinner, 45mm, but it was inclined at approximately 60 degrees from the vertical, which meant that shells striking it at typical angles were likely to deflect rather than penetrate. The practical protection offered by sloped armor of this kind was understood in the Soviet Design Bureau, though it was not yet universal practice among tank designers elsewhere. On firepower, here the Tiger held a clear and consistent advantage throughout the period in question. The 88mm KWK-36 could destroy a T-34 at distances of up to 1,500 meters under good conditions, and in some documented cases further. The T-34's 76mm F-34 gun needed to close to within 500 meters to have a reliable chance of penetrating the Tiger's frontal armor. In open country, the vast steppes of southern Russia, for instance, that difference in effective range was tactically decisive. A Tiger crew with good visibility and a clear field of fire could engage T-34s before those crews had the opportunity to respond. Effectively, on operational range, the Tiger I carried enough fuel for approximately 140 kilometers of road travel before requiring resupply and considerably less across difficult terrain. The T-34's diesel engine, by contrast, gave it a range of up to 400 kilometers. During the fluid, rapidly shifting operations of 1943 and 1944, this difference was not a minor inconvenience. Tigers were regularly abandoned when their fuel ran out and recovery vehicles could not reach them in time. A tank with a superior gun and superior armor is of limited value if it cannot reach the battle. On production, this is, in the end, the figure that renders all others secondary. The Soviet Union produced approximately 57,000 T-34s. In the wartime variants that concern us here, Germany produced 1,347 Tigers across the entire war. That is a ratio of roughly 42 to 1. Whatever advantages the Tiger possessed in individual engagements, they were simply insufficient to offset a disparity of that magnitude. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July and August of 1943, has become the central reference point for almost every discussion of T-34s and Tigers. Within it, the engagement at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July has acquired a particular mythological weight. Described in many accounts as the largest tank battle in history, a Soviet triumph born of desperate courage against fearsome German machinery. The archival record, as it has become available over the past 3 decades, tells a somewhat different story. The historian Valeriy Zamulin, working from Russian military archives that had been largely inaccessible during the Soviet period, published a detailed reconstruction of the Prokhorovka engagement in 2011. His figures, which have since been broadly accepted by specialists on both sides of the former front lines, suggest that the two SS corps lost between 70 and 80 tanks on that day. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army lost somewhere between 300 and 400 darts by any conventional measure of tactical outcomes. That is a German victory. The ratio of losses was, on that particular day and in that particular engagement, heavily unfavorable to the Soviet side, and yet the German offensive at Kursk Operation Citadel failed completely, not because of what happened at Prokhorovka, but because of what was happening elsewhere simultaneously. On the same day that the Armour was meeting south of Prokhorovka, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov to the north of the Kursk salient, threatening to cut off the entire German position. 2 days later, Hitler suspended Citadel. The strategic situation that Germany had sought to reverse through the offensive remained unchanged and was, within weeks, significantly worse. The Tiger, at Kursk, did precisely what it was designed to do. It destroyed Soviet armor at ranges that Soviet guns could not match. Tiger crews in the SS Panzer Corps reported kill ratios that seem almost implausible until one understands the geometry of the engagements. T-34s advancing across open ground, toward prepared German positions, in daylight, with limited ability to identify or engage their opponents before being struck. What the Tiger could not do, what no tank, however capable, could do, was be in enough places at once to prevent the Soviet offensive on the northern shoulder, sustain its advance against deepening Soviet defensive lines, and simultaneously overcome the logistical constraints that were already beginning to tell. By the time Citadel was cancelled, several Tiger companies had been reduced to a handful of operational vehicles, not primarily through enemy fire, but through the accumulated mechanical strain of sustained operations. Part of what makes the Tiger's reputation so persistent is that it produced individual performances that are genuinely difficult to explain away. The most widely documented of these occurred on the 13th of June, 1944, near the Norman village of Village, where SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Whitman, commanding a single Tiger I, engaged and destroyed a column of British vehicles, tanks, armored carriers, half-tracks within a period of approximately 15 minutes. The accounts of that engagement vary in their details, as eyewitness accounts of combat invariably do, but the broad outline is well established. It was, by any measure, a remarkable piece of individual gunnery and situational awareness. Whitman was credited with more than 130 tank kills over the course of the war, and there is no credible reason to doubt that figure substantially. The difficulty with the individual ace narrative is not that it is untrue. It is that it is, by definition, not scalable. A nation can build 1,347 Tigers. It cannot, through any training program or institutional arrangement, produce 1,347 Michael Whitmans. And as the war continued and experienced crews were lost to enemy fire, to accidents, to illness, the average proficiency of Tiger crews declined, while the vehicles themselves remained complex, demanding, and unforgiving of inexperience. The Soviet approach was built around a different logic entirely. Crew training was compressed sometimes to a matter of weeks, and individual vehicle performance was accepted as lower as a result. What the system produced instead was volume, trained crews in sufficient numbers to replace losses, without degrading the overall fighting capacity of armored formations. By the standards of the German Panzerwaffe, this might have seemed like a sacrifice of quality for quantity. By the standards of a 4-year industrial war on the Eastern Front, it was the only viable strategy. In 1942, the year the Tiger entered production, the Soviet Union produced over 12,500 T-34s. Germany produced 78 Tiger-Is. The gap was not a matter of industrial efficiency alone, though. Soviet factories had made remarkable strides in rationalizing and simplifying the T-34's construction since 1940. It was also a matter of deliberate design philosophy. The T-34 had been designed, from the beginning, to be built by workers without specialized skills, on machinery without the precision tolerances that German engineering traditionally demanded. The result was a tank that was, in some respects, crude, but that could be produced in quantities that made individual crudeness irrelevant. By the end of 1943, Soviet commanders and engineers had reached a shared conclusion. The 76mm gun with which the T-34 had entered the war was no longer adequate against the German armor they were encountering. The Tiger and the newer Panther both presented frontal armor that the F-34 gun could not reliably penetrate at typical engagement ranges. Something heavier was required. The solution that emerged was the T-34-85, which entered production in early 1944. The new variant mounted an 85mm gun derived from the same family of anti-aircraft weapons that had, ironically, provided the basis for the Tiger's own main armament, in a substantially enlarged turret that could accommodate a crew of 3 rather than 2. The third crew member freed the commander from the dual role of commander and gunner that had been one of the original T-34's most significant tactical weaknesses. A commander who is aiming a gun cannot observe the battlefield. A commander who can observe the battlefield has an enormous advantage in almost every tactical situation. The 85mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges of between 500 and 800 meters under favorable conditions. It did not close the gap entirely. The Tiger's KWK-36 retained its advantage at longer ranges, but it meant that the engagement was no longer as one-sided as it had been in 1942, and much of 1943 Soviet crews could now engage Tigers with a realistic prospect of success, provided they managed the range and approach carefully. The T-34-85 was the tank that Soviet armored forces took into Operation Bagration in June 1944. The offensive that destroyed Army Group Center and is considered by many military historians to be the single most operationally successful campaign of the Second World War. Within 10 weeks, 3 German army groups had been shattered. More than 400,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, and the front line had moved 600 kilometers westward. The T-34-85 did not win Bagration alone, of course, but it was present in numbers, it was reliable, and it was good enough. The question of which tank was better is, in the end, a question about what we mean by better, and that depends entirely on what we think tanks are for. If a tank's purpose is to defeat other tanks in individual combat, then the Tiger-I was, for most of its operational life, the superior vehicle. Its gun outranged the T-34's. Its armor resisted the T-34's fire more reliably. In a direct engagement on open ground, with experienced crews on both sides and adequate fuel in both vehicles, the Tiger crew had the better of the odds. But if a tank's purpose is to contribute to the defeat of an enemy army across a sustained campaign, to be present in sufficient numbers, in the right places, at the right times, and in working order, then the picture changes substantially. The Tiger was expensive to build, difficult to maintain, hungry for fuel, hard to transport by rail, and slow to maneuver. It was a vehicle that required exceptional crews, exceptional logistical support, and exceptional conditions to realize its potential. When those conditions were met, it was formidable. When they were not, it became a liability. The T-34 was none of these things in the superlative sense. It was not the most heavily armored tank of the war, nor the most powerfully armed, nor the most comfortable for its crew, who worked in conditions that were, by all accounts, quite cramped. But it was available, it was repairable, it could be driven by a crew trained in weeks rather than months, and when it was destroyed, as many tens of thousands were, another could take its place within a matter of days. Produced in one of the factories east of the Urals where the production lines ran without pause. Ultimately, is what decided the war on the Eastern Front, not any single battle, and not any single vehicle, but the capacity to absorb loss and continue fighting. The Tiger was a weapon that Germany could afford to build in hundreds. The T-34 was a weapon that the Soviet Union could afford to build in tens of thousands. In the kind of war that the Eastern Front became, that difference was insurmountable. First, that the Tiger was effectively invincible. Tigers were destroyed regularly by T-34s attacking their flanks and rear, by artillery, by air attack, and increasingly by the T-34-85 from 1944 onward. No production tank of any era has been invincible. The Tiger's frontal armor was formidable, its flanks and rear were significantly more vulnerable, and Soviet crews were trained to seek those angles. Second, that Prokhorovka was a decisive Soviet armored victory. The loss ratios at Prokhorovka favored the German side substantially. The Soviet strategic success at Kursk had more to do with the failure of the overall German offensive and the Soviet counter-offensive to the north than with the tank engagement in the fields south of the village. Third, that the T-34 was a crude or primitive design. The T-34 incorporated several features: sloped armor, a diesel engine, wide tracks, good power-to-weight ratio that were, in 1940, genuinely advanced. The German commission that examined captured T-34s in 1941 described it as the best tank in the world. That assessment may have been colored by the shock of encountering something unexpected, but it was not without foundation. Fourth, that Soviet tank crews were simply expendable. Soviet crews showed considerable skill and courage throughout the war, and by 1944 Soviet armored formations were demonstrating operational sophistication, deep battle, coordinated arms, rapid exploitation that was fully comparable to German armored doctrine at its best. The early years of the war, when inexperience and poor communications led to catastrophic losses, should not define the entire Soviet armored experience. Fifth, that the Tiger always won and own ranges below 500 meters, in close terrain, or from 1944 onward when the T-34-85 became available, the outcome of individual engagements was far less certain than the Tiger's reputation implies. The Tiger's advantages were real and significant, but they were advantages of range and frontal protection. Remove those conditions and the contest became considerably more even. There are, today, approximately 500 surviving T-34s around the world in museums, on pedestals outside government buildings, in town squares from Moscow to Ula. There are fewer than 10 surviving Tigers, spread across a handful of collections in Europe and North America. The disproportion is, in its way, the final accounting. Both tanks were the products of societies under extreme pressure, making decisions about materials, about labor, about industrial priorities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Both were driven by men who were, almost without exception, quite young, and who died at rates that are difficult to fully comprehend from a distance of 8 decades. What they left behind was not simply a story about which vehicle was more capable. It was a demonstration of something rather more general, that, in a sustained industrial war, the capacity to produce and replace matters more than the capacity to impress. The Tiger impressed. The T-34 endured. If this kind of careful look at the history interests you, there is more in the series. The next video examines the Stuka dive bomber, another vehicle whose reputation has been shaped at least as much by mythology as by operational record. The link is on screen now. Thank you for watching. Appendix. Research notes and recommended sources. The following works informed the factual claims in this script. Where specific figures appear, production numbers, loss ratios, engagement distances, they are drawn from scholarly sources rather than popular accounts. Primary academic sources: Zamulin, Valeriy, Demolishing the Myth, The Tank Battle at Prokhorovka, July 1943, 2011. Essential revised loss figures based on direct archival work. The most reliable reconstruction of Prokhorovka available in English. Jentz, David M. Anhouse, Jonathan. The Battle of Kursk, 1999. The standard English-language academic reference for the wider Kursk campaign, Jentz. Thomas L. Tiger I Heavy Tank 1942-45, 1993. Definitive technical reference for specifications and production data. Zaloga Stephen JT3 485 Medium Tank 1944-94, 1996. Concise and accurate technical and operational history. Harrison. Mark Accounting for War, Soviet Production, Employment, and the Defense Burden. 1940-1945, 1996. The most reliable source for Soviet industrial and production statistics. On the lesser-known facts in the opening section. The Christie Suspension Connection, Milsom. John Russian Tanks, 1900-1970, 1970. Also Kinnear James, Soviet Armour before 1941. Various Mikhail Koshkin's biography and the demonstration drive to Moscow. Mikhail Tank Power of the USSR, 2008, in Russian. Key details in Zaloga's works. The German Commission's 1941 assessment of the T-34 Friese Karl-Heinz, The Blitzkrieg Legend, 2005. Also referenced in Jentz 1993. Dmitry Lavrenenko's combat record. Smyslov, Oleg, Top Aces of World War II. Various Russian military histories. 52 confirmed kills. Kiev, December 18, 1941. A note on contested figures. Production totals, kill ratios, and loss figures for both sides remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. The figures used in this script represent the current academic consensus as of the time of writing, and where a range exists, the more conservative estimate has been preferred. Viewers are encouraged to consult the sources above directly for a fuller picture of the uncertainties involved.